Welcome, everyone. As people are joining us, I'm just going to start going through some of the housekeeping. I'd like to start, of course, by welcoming everyone to today's Community Advocacy webinar. We're thrilled to have you joining us. My name is Susan Hedstrom. I'm the Executive Director at the Foundation for Prader-Willi Research, and I will be your moderator today. With Soleno Therapeutics planning to submit a new drug application to the FDA in the next few months, this is an opportune time for us to come together as a community to learn more about the application review process and to ensure that the patient voice is heard. So thank you for joining us. A group of PWS advocates have come together to form the PWS Advocacy Coalition to host today's webinar and to advance a petition to the FDA that we will discuss later on today. Today's speakers are James Valentine and Larry Bauer from Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara, who are experts in rare disease drug development and FDA review, having both previously worked at the FDA. James has worked the last 15 years as a champion for the patient voice as part of the regulatory process. James previously worked at the FDA where he was a patient liaison, helping to incorporate the patient voice into medical product review across the FDA's various medical product centers and review divisions. There, he helped to develop and launch the patient-focused drug development initiative. Larry worked at the NIH for 17 years in clinical research, followed by a position at the FDA as a regulatory scientist in the Center for Drug Development, Evaluation, and Research's Rare Disease Program, a group he co-founded and worked for 10 years where he advanced rare disease drug development. In private practice, James and Larry have worked with many patient organizations to ensure their company's voices, the community's voices, were heard by decision makers. They have worked with many rare disease communities, including ALS, Duchenne, Friedreich's ataxia, SMA, EB, and so many more to help get new drugs approved. James and Larry are now going to give us an overview of how drugs are developed, reviewed, and approved, as well as share how you can help in this process. So James and Larry, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's a pleasure to be here with you all tonight, and it is so heartening to see this community, the way that they've come together to form this coalition. So to begin with, I would like to give an overview of what James and I will be speaking about tonight. We'll talk about how drugs are developed, what is a new drug application, the timeline for NDA review, and then the pre-NDA meeting, a little bit about FDA advisory committees, and then an overview of the new drug, DCCR, and a call to participate in the petition to the FDA, which you'll hear about just a little bit later. And then we're going to try to leave plenty of time for Q&A. Next slide. So first, to start off, how are drugs developed? This is just to give some foundational knowledge. It's probably things that some of you know already, but I think it's good to be reminded. So we all know that drug development is a long and challenging process. It can take many years from beginning to end, from the first concept until a drug is approved. New drugs are discovered through a variety of different ways. Sometimes there are new insights into the disease process that maybe are happening in people that are involved in research. And these new insights might show that there's a new pathway to develop a drug. There's also sometimes testing of many compounds to find one with the potential benefit. And then sometimes there's existing treatments that may have unexpected effects. So maybe a drug is approved for some other condition, and then it's discovered that there's a certain mechanism within that drug that might be able to help a different disease. And then there's also the development of new technologies like gene therapy. So when gene therapy came on, into the world of drug development, it opened up a whole new, pathways for potential new therapies. And once researchers identify a promising compound, the development of that compound, it follows a well-established path to make sure that the compound is safe and effective when it reaches the public. And that's the main goal for the FDA. So I'm just going to take you quickly through these steps. If you see at the bottom, the arrows move from left to right. So the first part of the diagram is the preclinical work. This is work that is done before a drug is tested in humans. It's often animal work or things that are done in the test tube. The goal at this stage is to determine if the new drug is at least basically safe for initial human use. And they also are very interested, to start learning, does it potentially have an effect on the disease of interest? After you have a preclinical work, you move into phase 1. This is something called investigational new drug application submission. This is an application to the FDA, and the FDA reviews the preclinical data and makes a decision whether they're going to allow the drug to be tested in clinical trials in human beings. The emphasis on phase 1 is on drug safety. So are there any serious side effects? How is the drug metabolized? How is it excreted? And I do just want to make the point that this emphasis on safety is actually in every single phase of drug development. After phase 1, if you got that initial data, you move to phase 2. You can start to evaluate the drug's effectiveness, something called proof of concept. Once again, safety is at phase 2 is also a key issue where you're looking at any safety issues or side effects. And at this phase, we might start having a clinical trial where we're comparing the drug to placebo to see which one, to test how it works. Next slide. From phase 2, we move into phase 3. This is a larger trial. Like I said, it allows the assessing for the duration of effect. How is the effect in different populations at different doses? In some disease, everyone doesn't have the exact same form of the disease. So in the phase 3 study, you might be looking at how it affects these different populations. These are larger trials, often, at least for common diseases, they get into the hundreds of patients rather than, tens or 20s. It's randomized, placebo-controlled trials. They're very interested at this stage in seeing whether or not the drug actually affects the disease that it's supposed to be affecting. And there's established endpoints before the trial begins, and they want to see how it works on those endpoints. They also, in the safety evaluation, they want to possibly see if there's any potential drug-drug interactions. For instance, if someone's already taking a different drug, like blood pressure medication, does it have interactions with that? After phase 3, all of the data is collected into an NDA or BLA filing at the FDA. This is when all the data is submitted to the FDA. So it's the animal, human data, everything from the development program. And this is the time when FDA reviews everything that's come in to make, they want to evaluate the safety of the trial data, the efficacy, and then to make this decision, do the potential benefits of this new treatment outweigh the risks? And finally, they decide whether or not to approve it. After a drug is approved, the FDA is still involved in post-market surveillance. So the drug is on the market, but they continue to collect safety data after approval, because after approval is when many, many more people will be taking it. So there might be a side effect that's very rare, but that would emerge at this point. And the FDA, they have an active post-market safety surveillance program to monitor adverse events. Next slide. So what is an NDA? It's a new drug application. I'd mentioned this earlier. It tells the full story of the drug. Its purpose is to provide information to the FDA so they can, as I said, make that benefit and risk decision. A drug developer must include everything about the drug at every stage of the drug development. They have to include all the reports on studies, data, and analyses. And as well, they have to include directions for use, information about potential drug abuse, and also to propose a label that would appear on the drug for directions of use. Next slide. So formally, an NDA is a type of application in which a pharmaceutical or manufacturer, they request permission from FDA for approval because they want to market the new drug. As I said, they include everything: chemical, pharmacologic description of the drug, and the results of clinical trials with respect to the indication for that they are seeking the drug to be licensed for. An NDA is used for drugs that are subject to drug approval provisions of the United States Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C Act. And a biologics license application is required for biologic products. Those are things like viruses, gene therapies, things like that. Next. So the goals of the NDA are to provide enough information to permit the FDA reviewer to reach the following key decisions. They need to decide whether the drug's safe and effective in its proposed use, whether the benefits outweigh the risks, whether the drug's proposed labeling and the package insert, if those things are appropriate to inform prescribing decisions so that people know how to take the drug, and then whether the methods used in manufacturing the drug and the controls used to maintain the drug's quality are adequate to preserve the drug's identity, strength, quality, and purity. In other words, to make sure that every time someone takes that drug, it's the exact same thing. Next slide. So most NDA and BLA applications are submitted electronically. When I first started at the FDA back in 2009, we were still getting paper submissions. The halls of the FDA were stacked exactly like this desk. This is the amount of data, just to give you an idea of the amount of data that is submitted with each NDA or BLA application. It's pretty astounding. So on that note, I turn it over to my colleague, James.
Yeah, thank you so much, Larry. And it's such a pleasure to be with this community this evening for those of us here on the East Coast, but for wherever you are around the world, whatever time zone you're in. So yes, as you can imagine, these NDAs, contain incredible amounts of information. So it takes a long time for drug developers to put this information together so that way it can be submitted to FDA. It has to be organized in the right way, all of the analyses done in the appropriate ways. So that way, when FDA gets this information, and we'll talk a little bit more about NDA review timelines, FDA, is diving in deep to all of this information. And for the first time when they review an NDA, are they really actually accessing the data and doing a full analysis of the data? Up until this point, throughout development, FDA sees summaries, but they don't actually get the underlying data, which they do when they're reviewing an NDA, and they'll actually conduct their own analyses of this data as part of that really fulsome review. So what I'd like to do, and now that we've kind of covered some of what might have been a little bit of a refresher for you all, is kind of, go one level deeper and talk a bit about how the process and the timelines for NDA submission and review and approval decisions. Because drug development takes many years, sometimes over a decade, to develop a drug, and then all of a sudden we're really focused on what is in the scheme of things a relatively short period of time when we're finally getting to this point of an NDA submission and review. And so one of the first things I want to talk a little bit about is the pre-NDA meeting. So even before an NDA is submitted to FDA, there's meetings that happen, and sometimes it takes multiple meetings, but we kind of generally refer to a pre-NDA meeting as a single meeting between FDA and a sponsor. A sponsor is just the word we use for the drug developer. And the drug developer will request the meeting with FDA and lay out essentially what they are planning for their upcoming NDA application. So they're going to submit questions around all of that information Larry talked about, the manufacturing information, the non-clinical, the clinical, both pharmacology, efficacy, and safety. So they're putting forward, kind of here's what we plan to include, here's our approach to analyzing this data, here's even how we would plan to organize it. And so, in this meeting, then FDA is going to give their perspectives on the acceptability of both the scope, the amount of information, as well as the strength or the quality of the results from those different studies that are being provided, as well as give feedback on the format and the approach to doing those analyses. And at the same time, they'll be talking about the proposed timeline for submission. There may be some things that have already concluded, like clinical trials. There might be other pieces of work that are happening, like pulling together some of that manufacturing information as manufacturing often scales up, to be able to provide drug to the entire, population that that could access it once approved. So sometimes that type of work is happening in addition to, other things that need to happen to get analyses to match what FDA really expects. So pre-NDA meetings, when do they happen? They can happen as, I guess we should say as late as a month or two prior to the sponsor's plan submission of their NDA. Although a lot of the time, I would say most of the time, this happens actually several months because the drug developer, they need time to actually go and do the analyses, perform that work, compile that in the way that FDA wants. Or like I said, there might be a few things that are just straggling pieces of information, that the drug company is waiting for, to be able to have that complete application. And we'll get back to that idea in a moment of having a complete application and why that's so important. And so FDA, as I mentioned, they're going to be giving their feedback. There's this whole process of this, the company asks particular questions, FDA responds and gives feedback, and then that's discussed at the meeting. And, the real goal of a pre-NDA meeting is to identify gaps. You don't want to have one of these meetings and FDA not tell you or tell the drug developer, what they view as potential gaps. Some might be certain gaps. Some might be, we're not so sure, but I guess we'll know when we see it when it comes in with your NDA. And so in some cases, a pre-NDA meeting could even require, a drug company to have to go do a whole new clinical trial. I mean, that's you hope by this point in time, you will have had enough discussions to understand if that's too, if the data package is too preliminary or not. But in rare diseases, a lot of the time, that question of whether another study is really needed or not, is a question that almost goes into the entire review of the NDA because it's not so clear. And like I said, FDA hasn't had a chance to do a deep dive into the data yet. So they're making all of their judgments, based off of a fairly high level understanding of the data. So once, a drug developer, they get this feedback, they address any of these issues, I say issues, but sometimes it's really just kind of like different perspectives that FDA has of how they want things organized or analyzed. And then the developer gets ready to submit that full NDA package like Larry described. So this NDA package, it's put together, it's submitted to FDA. FDA then has 2 months to decide whether or not to file the NDA. And this is really, really important. So the company submits it to FDA. So when a company says, hey, we're planning to submit, this is what they're talking about. They're planning to put in the NDA to FDA. FDA then has to look and do a filing review, and it has 60 days to do this. And they can deem an application either to be incomplete, meaning it's missing key information that without that, it can't actually do a review, or they can say that on its face, the information is there, but it's too deficient for us to be able to draw conclusions. Like we think that there's not, it's so deficient that we could never, agree that this drug is effective, or that we could never agree that this drug is safe. And so if FDA either determines that the application's incomplete, now if there's little things missing, FDA will, during that review, ask the company, hey, we noticed this page of this report was missing. Can you submit that to us? That's not what I mean by incomplete. I mean, something actually should have been like a certain study should have been conducted and it was never conducted. And so FDA would view that as incomplete. So this is important because if FDA determines that the application is either incomplete or deficient on its face, FDA can do what's called refuse to file the NDA. So this means we're not even going to do that review of the data. We think that these deficiencies or these gaps need to be addressed, and you can come in and you can resubmit your NDA in the future if you can find a way to address these gaps, but we're just not going to do that NDA review. And so, that obviously is not something that is good for any party, because you're, essentially taking all this time and effort and energy to put together this application. And, there's such a discrepancy that FDA is saying that it's not possible to approve this product, or we think that there's clearly a gap that's required to be addressed. So the goal is to, that's why you have that pre-NDA meeting and other meetings with FDA to try to make sure that, that refuse to file doesn't happen. But again, in rare diseases, as was mentioned, Larry and I have a lot of experience in a lot of different rare diseases. Sometimes it's really unclear, exactly where FDA is going to land in terms of whether or not they're going to actually file an NDA. So assuming that NDA does get filed, that's when the FDA's review clock starts. And so when FDA files an application, they either designate it as a standard review, which is a 10-month review clock, or a priority review, which is for serious conditions with unmet medical needs, where FDA concludes that the product, if approved, would address one of those serious unmet needs. And if that designation is granted, then FDA has a shorter clock, just 6 months to do its review, with the goal of getting, therapies that are for those types of situations to patients more quickly. So once an NDA is under review, it's not like it's completely silent. The company will have a couple of preset meetings during the review period. Primarily, those are for FDA to give updates to the applicant around the midpoint and then a late cycle meeting with FDA. I'll show you a little figure of that on the next slide. But also throughout this whole period, FDA is issuing what are called information requests, which is just, hey, we've got this question. Can you, analyze the data this way? Hey, we can't find this. Can you point us to where it is? Oh, we found this discrepancy. Can you explain it? All these different kinds of questions that it's just easier to ask the company than to try, because they're the ones that own the data and know it. And so these information requests are happening and companies responding to these, requests. Sometimes, though, a response by a company back to FDA can be deemed by FDA to be what's called a major amendment. So it's considered a major amendment to the NDA. And what this means is FDA saying this is, a big enough new piece of information that we actually need more time to be able to review it in this review cycle. If had this been in the original NDA, we could have reviewed it in the regular review cycle, but we actually feel we need to extend this. That type of extension can only happen once, and it extends that review clock by 3 months. So if you have a priority review, that's a 6-month review, that will now become a 9-month review. Now, what happens once the major amendments happen, and what if some other big piece of information comes into FDA? Well, FDA still can accept that information, but they are then in the position of deciding, is this really so big that we truly can't review it as part of this current review clock? In which case, they would tell the company, hey, we just can't actually take this into account. So that may or may not affect the outcome of our review. The final thing I want to mention here is that during this review period, another activity that can happen, it's optional, is FDA can decide to have an advisory committee meeting. You might have heard about advisory committee meetings. I know this community is somewhat familiar with them. And so, this is an opportunity for FDA to seek outside expert input. It also allows for public input as part of the process. But this is really advisory to them. So it gives them additional insights and input to help guide their review that still ultimately FDA has to make. So I promised I would give you a little, kind of a figure here to reference. So you can see moving from left to right, we're, in the pre-submission activities, that's where things like the pre-NDA meeting are happening. Day 0 is the day that the NDA is filed by FDA. And so from there, you can see across the top in black, the different time points for a standard review, and in red, the different time points for a priority review. And you can see then, throughout this, those different orange diamonds, are different touch points. There's all those information requests happening all the time, but these are the major time points. At day 45, that's when the company is given their filing communication, which outlines any initial review issues that FDA already has identified early in the review process. They give a mid-cycle meeting where they give an update, either at month 3 for priority review or month 5 for standard review. FDA says, hey, this is what's changed from the very beginning. Here's new items that have been added. We've taken certain review issues off the table. And then ultimately you have a late cycle or wrap-up meeting that says, here's the things, even at the kind of the 11th hour, we're still struggling with. You can see as part of that, FDA usually will conduct an advisory committee meeting, definitely in the second half of the review, most typically, about 3/4, of the way, somewhere around, the 7 or 8 month mark in a standard review. And then just to close this out here, you can see that, in the early stages of FDA's review, they're kind of actually planning their review. And then they get into actually rolling up their sleeves and conducting the review. But then at the end of the process, they do need to actually have made some review decisions at the reviewer level that they then make those recommendations to their division directors, to the office directors above that. And then those individuals have to actually make the final decisions. So, the whole review team, they're doing the deep dive into the data. They make recommendations to the leadership, who ultimately in those final months, of course, they're going to be paying attention throughout what's going on, but there's time built in at the end for them to deliberate and kind of come to their own conclusion. So we won't spend too much time on advisory committees today. I know that the PWS Advocacy Coalition, should advisory committees be coming, coming up for this community, will be reconvening to share even more information. But this is just to kind of remind everyone that, these advisory committees, as part of this process, it is something that, you all should be paying attention to see if FDA is going to be convening this committee to try to bring in outside expert input. It's important because, it helps supplement the internal FDA thinking, but it also provides that opportunity for public input. Ultimately, as I mentioned, the committee is going to be making recommendations. FDA still is the one that ultimately decides whether to approve the NDA or not. And kind of just looking at the statistics across FDA advisory committees, FDA, usually, about 85% of the time comes to the same conclusion that the advisory committee does. These are generally announced 6 to 8 weeks ahead of having an advisory committee. So FDA will publish a notice in what's called the Federal Register. This is a public meeting, so almost always are they public. And so, people are given the information about how to attend. Typically need to register for these. And in recent years, they've mostly been virtual, so participation can be virtual. Although we know starting in June of this year, FDA has the option to hold any advisory committees in person. So there is the possibility, and I think there are some already that have been scheduled to be in person, in which case attending the meeting would be in person, and usually they would have a virtual live stream as well. I've mentioned a couple of times that advisory committees are important because they do provide an opportunity during the NDA review for public input. And so this is primarily through 2 ways. One is written letters submitted to that docket. That those letters, if submitted kind of within a certain time frame, actually get to provide it ahead of time to advisory committee members to review. The other way is through the spoken testimony at the open public hearing, which is a more limited opportunity because there's not a lot of time for that. So, only a small number of people will have an opportunity to speak during the meeting, which is why it's nice to have both of those things available. So it gives there at least is a mechanism for everyone to have a voice. And as I mentioned, should any advisory committees be announced, like for DCCR, after any NDA submission and filing of that application, this group will come back together to give more specific information and guidance. So this takes us to kind of, why we're having this meeting now. We know DCCR, diazoxycholine, has been being developed by Soleno for 10 years, in clinical development. This community probably needs no, this information on this slide, but, that evidence that's been collected through trials over that period of time, have provided evidence that DCCR can help regulate appetite and reduce hyperphagia. It also helps improve some difficult behaviors to manage. There's been evidence of reducing resistance to insulin and even potentially leptin. And there's evidence that it helps limit the accumulation of excess body fat. And so there's, multiple lines of evidence that shows the different ways that DCCR, may be able to help people living with PWS. We all know that there's currently no FDA-approved treatments for hyperphagia or other PWS-related behaviors. There's only growth hormone. And so given that there's been, these kind of consistent benefits that have been shown across different clinical studies, and so far, the drug profile, it's kind of a well-established product, but even within the Prader-Willi clinical trials, has been a manageable, safety side effect profile. We know that all of this information is coming together, and if approved, this would be a drug that would be available to people living with PWS if prescribed by their doctors. We also always know that every drug is not going to be as effective for every person, or, there might be, certain side effects that only affect certain people. So, no result is going to apply either on the benefit or risk side to every person equally. But overall, the totality of the experiences through, so many in this community who have, volunteered to be a part of this clinical development program by participating in clinical trials, has led to, kind of this culmination of data that, now is being put together into a new drug application. And Soleno's announced that it's going to be submitting that to FDA, mid this year. And, we're getting close to the middle of this year. So that's why this coalition has come together, to want to, at this point in time, educate all of you in the community, but also recognize that this, even before an NDA is submitted, this is actually a really important time for the patient voice to be heard. FDA has recognized the importance and the value of the patient voice. Your community is no stranger to FDA. There's a long history of your community helping make sure that this disease, this condition of Prader-Willi, is one that can be researched, helped make the community research ready, and then ultimately didn't just leave it there once drug development happened, but then has brought the patient voice to FDA through listening sessions, other meetings, most recently the externally led patient-focused drug development meeting. And so you all have helped educate FDA a lot about Prader-Willi, but now that there's this application that's going to be coming in, there's an opportunity to express to FDA your views about how they should handle that application. And so this group has come together to put together a petition to FDA. A petition that, as you'll see, is going live tonight, and will run for a month to allow people to sign on, whether it's people living with PWS, all you parents and direct caregivers that are out there, your family members, your friends, community members, your healthcare providers, anyone that touches the lives of someone living with Prader-Willi that has some insight and thought about the value of a product like DCCR, is totally the appropriate type of person to help make sure that FDA understands the high unmet medical need of people living with PWS. And so the goal of this petition is to ask FDA to file an NDA for DCCR. And as I've described and built off of what Larry was talking about, the idea is that filing the NDA is so important because that would allow FDA to do that full review of the data. And, at this stage, we're not even talking about whether or not to approve the product because, the first important, action that FDA is going to take is to either file that application and not refuse to file that application. And so this petition will be collecting signatures. You can see the link to the petition here. The petition lays out information that any person can read, review, and decide if they agree with. It highlights that really significant, urgent, unmet medical need in Prader-Willi. It outlines, the history of the development. It actually goes through and shares the results of those different trials that Soleno has conducted over the past decade. It lays all of that out. And ultimately it concludes by saying, given all of this, we ask that Soleno and FDA urgently work together to try to get access to patients with Prader-Willi as quickly as possible. And as that first step, ask FDA to file this application once it's submitted to them. So this is an opportunity for you to, personally choose whether you want to sign on, for you to share this with others who you think may want to sign on. And importantly, for those of you who are either living with Prader-Willi or are a direct caregiver, there will be an opportunity to have your voice directly heard by FDA by adding written comments. For those of you who have participated in any of the DCCR program and so have had access to the investigational drug, there'll be a particular question to you asking you to share your experience. And for those of you who have not been able or yet had access to DCCR, but are looking towards the potential approval of the drug, you all will have a question that can give you the opportunity to share what it is that, essentially access would mean to you. And so that's an optional question. You can sign on to the petition without, writing that comment. But we thought it was important to give you the option, to actually put into your own words, not just the words that were written by the coalition and put into the petition, but to put your own words and your own meaning behind your signature. So you can access this at www.bit.ly/PWS petition listed here on this slide, or you can use that QR code. You can actually pull out your phone right now, open up the camera on your phone and scan that, and it'll take you right to that. It is already live. It went live today, and it will be open for the next 4 weeks. So at this point, actually, I'll just keep that up for you all so you can continue to access that link. But I think we're going to shift to the Q&A portion of this. So I'll hand it back over to Susan.
Well, thank you so much, James and Larry, for this incredible presentation. As you mentioned, at this time, we will open up our call to Q&A. Questions can be submitted through the Q&A feature of Zoom. So if you want to submit a question, find Q&A, type in your questions there. It may be worth stating at this point that none of us on the webinar have new information to share about Soleno's planned submission. For now, all we know is that Soleno plans to submit the application mid-2024, which could be basically any day. But as new details do become available, you can be sure that we will share them with you as soon as we know. Also, if you have any questions specifically about Soleno's study data, that information has been included with the petition, and the URL is shared for you here on the screen. So if you have questions about study data, please refer back to the petition to answer any of those questions. We're taking questions. Let's see. First question, how common is it for patient groups like us to petition the FDA as you're proposing? And what kind of learnings can we gather from previous petitions?
It's a really great question. So one thing that's probably worth noting is that there is not a formal mechanism for patient communities like yours to provide this type of petition to the FDA. So this is a petition that is being kind of has been developed and is being run and will be submitted to all of the appropriate leadership at the FDA. But this is not following some formal FDA process to do so. That being said, this is not novel. This is something that other patient communities have done, and has in a number of cases has successfully led to not only NDA or BLA reviews, but ultimately approvals. An example, a couple of recent examples. The Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance did a petition for Reata's drug Skyclarys, the first ever drug to be approved for Friedreich's Ataxia. The ALS Association similarly did one for Amylyx's drug Relivrio for ALS. So this is a tool that has been used and certainly we believe has been leveraged by FDA to help understand the community position. And what that certainly those experiences helped inform the coalition deciding at this point to ask for FDA to even initially file the NDA, knowing that for some other not just rare diseases, but even including rare diseases, that FDA has not filed the application and done a full review. That we didn't want to get too ahead of where we were in the process, and thought that it's really important first to initially ask for FDA to even do a review in the first place.
Yeah, I just want to add to that when I was at the FDA, they really value input from the patient community. That's been a big movement at the FDA to hear directly from patients, caregivers, and a petition, like James said, there is no formal mechanism to submit a petition to the FDA, but this will send a message. It's going to send a message from this community about the unmet medical need that still exists, the importance of giving us a chance to have an improved therapy. And please, to give them the message to review this and to give it priority review so that it's reviewed more quickly.
Yes.
You mentioned in your presentation that prior to submitting a new drug application, there's often pre-NDA conversations between the sponsor and the FDA. Do we know if those conversations have taken place?
Yeah, so I do know that Soleno announced earlier this year, I don't remember exactly when the timing of when that was, that they had held a pre-NDA meeting with FDA. And it was based off of that interaction with FDA that they were planning, and their timeline for an NDA submission in mid 2024 was going to be the same. They didn't, have to push it back or anything like that based off of what they announced. So yes, a pre-NDA meeting between Soleno and FDA has already occurred.
Okay. I think you guys may have given such a good presentation that you answered everyone's questions, because we don't have a ton of questions coming in. Here's a couple. I think there was just a short little delay. Oh, okay. Could you share how individual advocates were selected for this consortium?
Yeah, so there were a number of advocates and advocacy groups who have been having conversations around different issues affecting PWS. I don't think there was a set defined specific list, but I've personally been engaged with many different advocates within the patient community for, I think almost 10 years now. Going back to a very early listening session that was had with FDA to convince FDA that obesity and body weight should not be the only primary endpoint in Prader-Willi syndrome. And so it was kind of a little bit of an ad hoc kind of meeting and gathering of organizations and advocates. And that kind of discussion led to kind of a decision to say, hey, let's call this a coalition. So there wasn't a formal kind of process to that. Certainly any there's room for additional advocates in the coalition as well. So you can reach out to Susan or really anyone on that list that we showed if you're an advocate in the community and want to be a part of the coalition. But really at this point, given that the petition is live and on its way, everybody's signature will be equal, whether you're a coalition member or not, in terms of that sign on that will be eventually delivered to the FDA.
How many people would you think would need to sign this petition in order for it to be meaningful?
There's really no right or wrong answer. I heard Larry kind of almost, make a sound that tells me that we probably are completely agreeing here that, certainly, with any petition, numbers do matter. I mean, that's the point of asking for signatures in the first place, is to show that there is support behind that. But there is no set minimum, number that's necessary to make an impact. I'd ask, maybe Larry, I don't know if you have thoughts, or even Susan, knowing your community and, the size of the active community, if obviously this is not a formal projection, but, if you have any thoughts about that.
I mean, I'm going to throw the glove. I'm going to say 1,000. Let's have a baseline of 1,000 signatures. When you get to the point of 1,000 or more, it just has a certain gravitas that's like, so if you guys can, I mean, we almost have 100 people just here on this call, so we don't have that much further to go to get to 1,000. So let's start that and then see where it goes above 1,000,
I don't remember how many signatures we got on the last petition that we did as a community, but it was well over 1,000. So it was impressive, and I have no doubt that this petition will be the same. I think that Kristen Gilly has a great question here, which are, what are best practices? How should we be sharing this petition? What tips or tricks might you have for us?
I mean, my suggestion is you do pull out all the stops, use all your social media channels. I'm sure you have online support groups, and then the message has to be that it's not just for the individual members that are participating in those things, but it's for each person. It's their circle, their family, their friends, their physicians, anyone that they know that would be willing to sign on in support of the community. And that ripple effect, I think, it could be tremendous. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. If you read that petition, you're saying, hey, I agree. I feel strongly enough that I want to put my name to it. If every person goes out and, goes to even just 2 or 3 other people, that, like, for Larry, you described as like the ripple effect. And then, I mean, that alone is going to be enough to, kind of break that 1,000 mark, sharing it within your networks, people who, may have been following your stories on, over time on social media. I mean, it's possible that maybe someone you hadn't even, talked to since high school or college, who feels, and almost knows your kid through social media, would feel compelled to sign on to this. And again, the great thing is that all of the information is in the petition itself. So you don't have to go and educate them necessarily about, again, what is PWS? I mean, what people with PWS are living with, that's in the petition. what's this drug about that the petition's about? That's in the petition itself. So, really just sharing that link, puts all of the really important information in front of them. And then I would say the other best practice would be to tell them why you personally signed, because that might be the thing that really, more than, looking at data or reading about what generally people with PWS are going through, they're, in your network for a reason. They care about you and your family personally. And so sharing, your personal reason for, signing the petition, would be another best practice.
And when you're sharing it with people that might not be as familiar, I would frame it that the only thing your signature means is that you're asking the FDA to give us a chance. That's all it means. It just says, just give us a chance. It doesn't mean we're asking for it to be approved. You've got to approve. We're just saying, like, just file it and review it, look at the data. So, I think as you reach out to people, say, this is just asking the FDA to give the Prader-Willi community a chance. And that's it. It's just give us a chance. So.
Is this petition in response to any concerns, or is this a proactive action?
Yeah, so this is absolutely a proactive action. There's no, specific, piece of, insider information that any of us on the coalition have that, is saying, we need to do this in response to some FDA feedback. It's just really the reality of, how hard it is for FDA to understand rare disease data. Certainly FDA approves a lot of drugs for rare diseases that are, on, weaker, much weaker data. This is, here we have multiple years and multiple studies of consistent findings, and FDA has for other rare diseases accepted, situations where there is no positive, primary data. That being said, there's also cases where there's, equally or maybe even more positive data where FDA has said no, more clinical trials are needed when the NDA comes in. And so knowing that that's always a possibility, and knowing that there's nothing more important than having FDA roll up their sleeves and actually wade into the data and see it for themselves. That's why taking this proactive measure for a petition is so important.
This next question I'm going to read verbatim. I don't think I can modify this. We've heard for so long about not pressuring the FDA for fear of them reacting badly to that pressure. How does this effort differ? Don't get me wrong, I love it, I'm here for it, I'm on it. Help me understand how this is different. Is the tone of giving us a fair shake rather than approve this drug?
Yeah. I would say that's exactly right. That is the different. This is a different tone. We are not pressuring them, okay, to approve the drug, which would be, we are trying to alter your decision making about evaluating the data. We are not saying that. We're just this is a request, basically. File it, give it a chance, review it, and then make your decision, and your decision is going to be your decision. So I think it's a step back from really trying to push the FDA to doing something that they wouldn't usually do. So
yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Great. What are the most reasons the FDA is slow or not approving? Is it our data or just the rarity of community disease?
So I think this is just the normal process, sadly. And that's why we did want to spend time tonight before getting to this petition topic, of walking through that process. The community is aware and knows of the clinical trial results and, the legacy of different clinical trial results over time that have come out, but for FDA, their process, they have to, have these meetings. These meetings take time. They have to wait then for this huge NDA submission to be pulled together. And then once it comes in, that's when they're going to start, their filing review and deciding whether they're going to accept the application after 2 months, and then actually start their review clock from there. So for those of you, I can't even imagine in the community, every day matters, and every day you're living with the reality of no drugs that are approved to treat these most important aspects of most troubling and burdensome aspects of Prader-Willi. But ultimately, this is a pretty formal process. And so, it feels like it's a really long time between these different steps and activities. But so far, based off of my experience, from where, Celino has, already had a pre-NDA meeting to working towards a NDA submission in the middle of this year, this is, all within, what is normal.
Yeah, I wish you each had the opportunity to be a fly on the wall at the FDA to see what a review entails. When it comes in, it goes to a project manager. Project manager has to review it. Once they do accept, they have some preliminary meetings. They have to organize a team of people to review it. So they have to have toxicologists to look at the animal data. They have to have clinicians to look at the medical and clinical trial data. They have to have statisticians to weigh, is the effectiveness data, is it meaningful or not? They sometimes, if it's a pediatric disease, they have to bring in pediatric specialists. So they have to assemble this team of people. They have to have a series of meetings. And then there's different milestone steps where people are reviewing it. And sometimes, like when there's a large, amount of clinical data, the clinical reviewer sometimes has to go into each person's case and review how is the data collected for that individual even. And sometimes they find some not so nice things, so I'm not saying in this case at all, but they take their job very seriously in being meticulous in the review of the data.
We have time for one last question, which I think is actually quite fitting to close up today's webinar, and that is, beyond the petition, are there any other activities that we should be doing to help send a message to the FDA on the urgent medical need for treatments for PWS?
Wow, and that's a really good question. Maybe the first thing I'll start by saying is that you all should be very proud as a community of what you have done, as long as, and even before I knew your community 10 years ago, but even up through, this past year, of keeping the drumbeat going and continuously teaching FDA, because FDA isn't FDA. FDA is many, many individual people. And those people, are looking at hundreds, if not thousands of different diseases. And then those people turn over like any workplace. So the same FDA that you were educating 5 years ago isn't necessarily the same FDA you're educating today. And so the fact that you all have kept that up and have continuously gone back and, done, so much what I'll call non-product specific education. You've helped lay a foundation about what PWS is and the unmet medical need that exists, that it's nice. So it's nice to have that, because that allows you to have this pivot point and start to give some product specific input to FDA, which is what this petition is all about. To actually directly answer the question, I would recommend staying focused on one step at a time. If you believe when you read the petition that, and there's no way that the petition is going to tell the whole story of the unmet need, please actually write a comment in and describe, from your lens, your point of view of experiencing PWS, what the unmet medical need is. Having those personal descriptions to supplement, what necessarily has to be a short petition document, is going to be really, really valuable. And then the other thing I'll say is stand by, because this coalition, when there becomes that next call to action, whether it be for an advisory committee and participating and submitting written comments for that, or something else. They will let all of the advocates and advocacy organizations that make up this coalition will let you know.
James and Larry, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you sharing more about the drug development process and the FDA review process. Your information is so incredibly helpful. For everyone, have a great evening. And we look forward to sharing the petition with you, as well as hopefully some new news.